I came home for Thanksgiving. Just me and my husband's stepdad sitting silently in his rocker. A note on the fridge read, "Gone cruising with my ex. You're on stepdad duty." He glanced up and smirked. Ready? I wasn't. But something about the quiet and him made me stay. I pushed open the front door of Brian's childhood home in Ohio, my breath catching in the cold November air. The house was supposed to be alive with Thanksgiving chaos. His mom's laughter, cousins arguing over football, the smell of turkey roasting. Instead, silence hit me like a wall. My boots squeaked on the worn hardwood and I froze, my duffel bag slipping from my shoulder. Something was wrong. My eyes darted to the kitchen where a single light glowed over the fridge. A piece of paper fluttered there, pinned by a magnet shaped like a pumpkin. I stepped closer, my heart thudding, and read Brian's messy handwriting. "Gone cruising with my ex. You're on stepdad duty." The words sliced through me, sharp and cold, like a knife I didn't see coming. My husband, my Brian, was gone. With her. I stood there, the note blurring as my eyes stung, betrayal wrapping around me like the chill of the empty house. How could he do this? I wanted to scream, to tear the note to pieces, but my hands wouldn't move. The silence pressed harder and I felt small, like the world had shifted under me. Carl was there in the corner of the living room, sitting in his old wooden rocker. The chair creaked, slow and steady like a heartbeat. His hands, rough from years at the factory, rested on the armrests, still as stone. He didn't look up at first, just stared out the window at the gray sky. I wondered if he'd heard me come in, if he knew about the note. Then his gray eyes flicked to mine, sharp and knowing. "You see the note?" he asked, his voice low, gravelly, like he'd smoked too many cigarettes in his day. I nodded, my throat tight, unable to form words. He leaned back, the rocker groaning, and a faint smirk crossed his face. Not cruel, but like he'd seen this kind of mess before. "Figures," he muttered, almost to himself. The creak of the chair filled the quiet again, and I stood there, clutching my coat, feeling like an intruder in a house I'd visited a dozen times. Carl's presence was heavy, not threatening, but solid, like he was part of the furniture, rooted in this moment of my unraveling. The house itself seemed to close in around me, its faded yellow wallpaper peeling at the edges, the air thick with the musty smell of old carpets and forgotten winters. I wandered to the hall, my eyes catching Brian's coat hanging on the rack, untouched, like he'd left in a hurry. It was the green one he wore every fall, the one I'd teased him about because it was too thin for Ohio's bite. Seeing it there, abandoned, made my chest ache. I moved to the kitchen where a pile of dirty dishes sat in the sink. Cereal bowls, a coffee mug with a lipstick stain that wasn't mine. The normalcy of it burned. Brian had been here, eating, drinking, living, while planning to leave me behind. I touched the mug, the ceramic cold under my fingers, and imagined him laughing with her, his ex, the one he swore was just a friend. The fridge hummed softly, the note still staring at me, mocking. I wanted to run, to drive back to our apartment in Columbus, but my legs felt heavy, tethered to this place. My mind spiraled, replaying our marriage like a movie I couldn't pause. Brian's late nights at the office, his phone always face down, the way he'd dodge questions about his day. Had I been blind? I sank into a kitchen chair, the wood creaking under me, and buried my face in my hands. My fingers trembled and I hated how weak I felt, how small. This wasn't supposed to be my Thanksgiving. I pictured our first holiday as a couple 3 years ago when Brian kissed my forehead and promised we'd always have each other. Now I was alone, stuck with Carl, a man I barely knew. We'd met at family dinners, exchanged polite nods, but he was Brian's stepdad, not mine. He'd always been quiet, watching more than talking, his face lined with stories he never shared. Facing him for a whole weekend felt daunting, like being stranded with a stranger. I glanced at the door, tempted to grab my keys and go, but something stopped me. The silence, maybe, or the way it held me, like it had secrets to tell. Carl shuffled into the kitchen then, his flannel shirt wrinkled, his steps slow but deliberate. He didn't look at me, just opened a cupboard and pulled out a chipped blue mug. The kettle hissed on the stove and he poured hot water, the steam curling in the dim light. "It's decaf," he said, setting the mug in front of me. His voice was softer now, less gruff, like he was trying not to scare me off. He didn't ask questions, didn't pry, just went back to his rocker, the creak starting up again. I stared at the coffee, the warmth seeping through the ceramic into my palms. It was such a small thing, but it grounded me like a lifeline in the storm of my thoughts. I took a sip, the bitterness sharp but comforting. Carl's gesture, simple as it was, made the house feel less hostile. I looked at him, his silhouette framed against the window, and wondered why he wasn't angry, why he wasn't railing against Brian's betrayal. Maybe he was used to it. Maybe he'd been here before. I stayed, the mug warm in my hands, the quiet wrapping around us both. The mug of decaf sat cooling in my hands, its warmth fading as I stared at the kitchen table, the wood scratched from years of family meals I'd never been part of. Carl's rocker creaked in the living room, a steady rhythm that felt like the only thing holding this strange morning together. I wanted to say something to break the quiet, but my throat felt tight, like the words were stuck behind a wall of hurt. Then Carl spoke, his voice rough but clear, like he'd been waiting for the right moment. "My first wife, Lorraine, she ran off with a guy from the tire shop. Left a note too, just like Brian's." I looked up, startled, meeting his eyes across the room. They were distant, clouded with a pain I hadn't expected. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and told me how Lorraine had packed a suitcase while he was at the factory, leaving only a scribbled goodbye. "Found it on the counter next to a half-empty coffee pot," he said, a bitter chuckle escaping. The story hit me hard, like a mirror to my own hurt, and I clutched the mug tighter, listening as his words filled the empty house. I wanted to share my own pain, to tell Carl how Brian's note had shattered me, but I hesitated. He was practically a stranger. Brian's stepdad, the quiet guy who'd nod at me during Christmas dinners and slip out early. I barely knew him, yet here he was, peeling back a piece of his life like it was nothing. My fingers traced the mug's chip, and I wondered if I could trust him with my mess. Finally I spoke, my voice shaky. "Did you ever get even with her? Lorraine, I mean." Carl's smirk returned, faint but sharp, like he'd been waiting for the question. "Revenge ain't always what you think," he said, rocking back. "Sometimes living well, moving on, that's enough." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning I wasn't sure I could grasp. They sparked something in me, though, a flicker of defiance, a whisper that maybe I could rise above Brian's betrayal. I set the mug down, the clink loud in the stillness, and felt a shift like I was waking up from a fog. Carl stood then, slow and deliberate, and shuffled to the mantel where a dusty photo sat in a chipped frame. He picked it up, his rough fingers gentle, and handed it to me. It was Brian as a kid, maybe 10, grinning wide with a missing tooth, his arm around a woman with kind eyes. His mom, Carl's late wife. "He was always letting her down," Carl said, his voice low. "Skipped her birthday once to go fishing with his buddies. Broke her heart." I stared at the photo, Brian's young face so familiar yet strange. The realization hit me like a cold wind. Brian's selfishness wasn't new. He'd been this way long before me, hurting the people who loved him. The photo felt like a puzzle piece, hinting at a pattern I'd been too blind to see. I handed it back, my hands unsteady, and Carl set it down carefully, like it was more than just a picture. Like it held all the weight of those broken promises. I needed air, needed to escape the house's heavy quiet, so I grabbed my scarf and stepped outside. The Ohio morning was crisp, the street lined with bare trees and faded lawns. I walked toward the corner, my boots crunching on gravel, when Mrs. Ellis, the neighbor with too much lipstick and a nosy smile, waved me over. "Saw Brian tearing out of here last week," she said, leaning on her rake. "Said he was off on some fancy trip. Didn't mention you, though." Her words stung, sharp and unexpected, like salt in a fresh wound. I forced a smile, mumbling something about errands, and hurried back to the house, my face burning. Brian had been lying to everyone, not just me. The whole town seemed to know more about his life than I did. I slammed the door behind me, the sound echoing, and leaned against it, my breath ragged. The betrayal felt bigger now, like it had roots spreading everywhere, choking me. Back inside, Carl was in his rocker again, the TV flickering with some old game show, the volume low. I sank onto the couch, the springs creaking under me, and we sat in silence, the hum of the TV blending with the rocker's rhythm. I glanced at his hands, scarred and calloused from years of hard work, and wondered what else he'd carried through his life. What other hurts had those hands held? He caught me staring and raised an eyebrow. "We've both been fools, haven't we?" he said, his voice soft but piercing. The words landed like a truth I hadn't wanted to face. I nodded, my eyes stinging, and looked away, focusing on the TV's glow. In that moment, the silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was shared, like a bridge built from our separate pains. I didn't know what came next, but for the first time I felt like I wasn't alone in this house, this hurt, this fight. The TV's faint buzz faded into the background as I sat on the creaky couch, Carl's words echoing in my mind. We've both been fools, haven't we? The living room felt smaller now, the air thick with the weight of our shared hurt. I couldn't sit still, my hands restless, itching for something to do. I glanced at the cluttered den across the hall, its shelves stuffed with old magazines and forgotten trinkets. Mind if I tidy up in there? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Carl shrugged, his rocker creaking. Knock yourself out, he said, eyes fixed on the game show's flashing lights. I stood, needing to move, to channel the storm inside me into something tangible. The den smelled of dust and stale coffee, the kind of place that held secrets in its corners. I started sorting through a pile of magazines, their pages yellowed, when my fingers brushed against a manila folder buried beneath. I pulled it out, my pulse quickening. Inside were bank statements, the name Brian Miller printed in bold. My breath caught as I scanned the numbers. Overdrawn accounts, unpaid loans, a financial wreck I'd known nothing about. I sank to the floor, papers spilling around me, my hands shaking as I read. The statements showed months of reckless spending, cash withdrawals, credit card debts, all hidden from me. Brian had been lying not just about his ex but about our life, our future. We talked about saving for a house, maybe a kid someday, but these papers screamed a different story. My chest tightened like the room was running out of air. I thought of our tiny apartment, the late-night arguments over bills, how he'd always brushed them off with a charming smile. Had it all been a lie? I clutched a statement, the paper crinkling, and felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just betrayal, it was destruction. He'd left me to drown in his mess. I wanted to scream, to call him and demand answers, but the den's quiet held me in place, the truth in my hands too heavy to ignore. I gathered the papers, my resolve hardening, and carried them to the living room where Carl's rocker still creaked. I dropped the folder on the coffee table, the thud startling Carl. "You need to see this," I said, my voice sharp, cracking with anger. He leaned forward, eyebrows raised, and flipped through the statements, his face unreadable. After a moment he nodded like he'd expected this. "There's more," he said, standing with a groan. He shuffled to his bedroom, returning with a small metal box rusted at the edges. He set it down and opened it, revealing a stack of printed emails, their edges curled. "Found these a couple years back," he said, handing me one. My eyes scanned the words, Brian's words, to his ex, bragging about starting fresh and leaving the baggage behind. My heart sank as I realized he'd meant me. Carl had kept these, silent proof of Brian's disloyalty, like a bomb he'd never detonated. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice trembling. Carl sighed, his eyes tired. "Wasn't my place. Not till now." The emails and statements swirled in my mind, a hurricane of betrayal. I paced the living room, my boots thudding on the worn rug, tears spilling down my cheeks. This wasn't just a cruise with an ex. It was a plan, a life Brian had built behind my back. He'd been draining our savings, plotting his escape while I'd been planning our future. My pacing stopped at the window where the gray sky pressed against the glass. I saw my reflection, pale and tired, and hated how weak I looked. The anger bubbled up hot and fierce, drowning out the fear. I gripped the emails, wanting to confront Brian, to make him feel this pain. But how? A phone call felt too small, too easy for him to dodge. I turned to Carl, who watched me quietly, his hands folded. "What do I do with this?" I asked, my voice breaking. He didn't answer right away, just rocked slowly, the creak steady as ever. Carl's silence stretched, and then he spoke, his voice low but firm. "I never told Brian's mom about those emails. Thought it'd break her more than he already had. I was wrong to stay quiet." He looked at me, his eyes sharp. "Don't make my mistake, Emily. Speak up." His words hit like a spark, igniting something inside me. I nodded, wiping my tears, and sat on the couch, the folder and emails beside me. Outside, a dog barked, and I glanced out, seeing a kid ride by on a bike, carefree in a way I couldn't remember feeling. I envied that freedom. Carl's regret, his warning, gave me a purpose. I wasn't going to let Brian's lies bury me. I picked up an email, rereading it, and felt a shift. Not just anger but determination. I'd face this somehow, and Carl's quiet strength made me believe I could. The afternoon light filtered through the living room curtains, casting soft shadows on the rug as I sat on the couch, Carl's words ringing in my ears. "Speak up." The emails and bank statements lay scattered on the coffee table, a paper trail of Brian's lies. My determination felt fragile, like a flame that could flicker out, but I clung to it. Carl stood, his rocker still, and gestured toward the kitchen. "Let's make something to eat," he said, his voice gruff but kind. No sense starving over him. I nodded, surprised by the idea of a Thanksgiving meal in this broken moment. We rummaged through the pantry, finding a can of green beans, some instant mashed potatoes, and a jar of gravy. The act felt rebellious, like we were stealing back a piece of the holiday Brian had ruined. I chopped onions, the sharp sting making my eyes water, and Carl heated the gravy, the kitchen filling with a warm, savory smell. For the first time since I'd walked into this house, I laughed, a small, shaky sound, when Carl grumbled about the potatoes sticking to the pan. It felt like defiance, cooking this meal like we were saying Brian didn't get to win. As we set the table, my fingers brushed against a photo tucked under a stack of napkins. It was last Thanksgiving, Brian's arm around me, his smile wide and warm. I remembered that day. He'd promised to be better, to stop the late nights, to build a real life together. My throat tightened, the memory cutting deeper than I expected. I set the photo face down, my hands trembling, and Carl noticed but didn't comment. Instead, he shared a story about Brian's mom, Ellen, and her love for Thanksgiving. "She'd spend all day cooking, humming old songs," he said, his eyes soft. "Brian never showed up on time. Always had an excuse." His words painted a picture of a woman who'd loved despite being let down, and I saw myself in her, waiting for Brian to change. The parallel hurt, but it also strengthened my resolve. I placed a fork on the table, the clink loud in the quiet, and felt a surge of anger, not just at Brian but at myself for believing in him so long. The doorbell chimed, startling us both. I opened the door to find Mrs. Ellis, her coat buttoned tight against the November chill, holding a pecan pie. "Thought you might need this," she said, her smile too bright, her eyes darting past me into the house. "Saw Brian's car at that motel off Route 40 a while back. Funny, right?" Her words landed like a slap, casual but cruel. My face burned and I mumbled a thank you, taking the pie with stiff hands. I shut the door harder than I meant to and set the pie on the counter, my heart racing. Motel. Another secret, another lie. I gripped the counter, my knuckles white, and felt the anger boil over. I grabbed a plate, slamming it onto the table with a crack that echoed. Carl looked up, his face calm but watchful. "Easy," he said, not scolding, just grounding. I took a breath, his steady presence pulling me back from the edge, and we finished setting the table in silence, the pie's sweet smell mixing with the gravy's warmth. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. My phone sat on the counter, a weight I'd been avoiding. I picked it up, my fingers cold, and dialed Brian's number. The line rang twice before he answered, his voice lazy, smug, like he was lounging on that cruise ship without a care. "Hey Em," he said, and the nickname grated, a reminder of a love that wasn't real. "What's up?" I swallowed, my voice steady despite the storm inside. "I found the bank statements, Brian. The loans, the overdrafts. Why didn't you tell me?" Silence stretched, heavy and telling. He stammered, "It's not what you think," but I cut him off, mentioning the emails Carl had shown me. His breathing changed, sharp and panicked, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. "We're done," I said, and hung up before he could respond. My hands stopped shaking and I set the phone down, the kitchen quiet except for the soft bubble of the gravy on the stove. We sat at the table, our makeshift meals spread before us. Lumpy potatoes, green beans, and gravy in mismatched bowls. Carl poured apple juice into 2 glasses and raised his, the liquid catching the light. "To moving on," he said, his voice low but firm. I clinked my glass against his, the sound sharp and clear, and took a sip, the sweetness grounding me. The food was simple, nothing like the feasts I'd imagined for Thanksgiving, but it felt sacred, like a vow we'd made to ourselves. I took a bite of potatoes, the warmth spreading through me, and looked at Carl, his face lined with years of his own battles. We didn't talk much, but the silence was different now, comfortable, shared. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, but in here, we'd carved out something real, a moment Brian couldn't touch. I set my fork down, my heart heavy but hopeful, and knew this was the start of something new. The last bite of mashed potatoes lingered on my tongue, warm and comforting as I leaned back in the kitchen chair, the apple juice glass empty in front of me. Carl's toast to moving on echoed in the quiet, the words settling like a promise. The makeshift Thanksgiving meal, simple as it was, felt like a victory, a reclaiming of something Brian had tried to steal. Morning light crept through the kitchen window, pale and soft, signaling the start of a new day. I stood clearing the plates when resolve surged through me sharp and clear. I grabbed my phone and typed a text to Brian, attaching a photo of the emails Carl had kept. I know everything. My thumb hovered over the send button, heart pounding, then pressed it. The whoosh of the message felt final, like closing a door. Minutes later my phone buzzed. Brian's name on the screen. I answered, my voice steady. "Emily, wait, I can explain," he stammered, panic lacing his words. "No," I said, calm but firm. "We're done." I hung up, the silence that followed lighter, like I'd shed a weight I'd carried too long. Carl watched from his chair, his eyes steady, no judgment in them. He stood, slow and deliberate, and disappeared into the hallway. When he returned, he held a small notebook, its leather cover worn soft, pages yellowed at the edges. "This was Ellen's," he said, handing it to me. "Recipes, thoughts, little bits of her." I opened it, my fingers careful, and saw neat handwriting. Recipes for cornbread, notes about spring flowers, a line about loving Carl's laugh. My throat tightened, touched by the gift, by the trust in his gesture. "She'd want you to have it," he added, his voice gruff but warm. I clutched the notebook, its weight grounding me, a reminder of Ellen's strength, of the woman who'd faced her own hurts and kept going. "Thank you," I whispered, meeting his gaze. Carl nodded, a faint smile breaking through, and shuffled back to the sink, rinsing a dish like it was just another morning. The notebook felt like a talisman, something to carry as I stepped into whatever came next. As I stacked the dishes, I thought about Carl, alone in this house since Ellen's passing. I remembered Mrs. Ellis's pie, her nosy but kind gesture, and an idea sparked. "Carl, does Mrs. Ellis ever invite you over?" I asked, drying a plate. He snorted, scrubbing a pan. "She's always yammering about her card games. Too much chatter for me." I smiled, hearing the grumble but also the loneliness beneath it. "Maybe give it a try," I said, keeping my tone light. "She's looking out for you." He paused, sponge in hand, and gave a small shrug. "Maybe," he muttered, but his eyes softened, like the idea wasn't so bad. I felt a warmth, small but real, knowing I'd nudged him toward something brighter. I hung the dish towel, the kitchen tidy now, and glanced at the clock. It was time to go, to face the world beyond this house. But the thought didn't scare me as much anymore. I packed my duffel in the guest room, folding my sweater, zipping my toiletries bag. The house was quiet, the creak of Carl's rocker gone for now. I stepped into the hall and saw him on the porch, hands in his pockets, staring at the street. I joined him, my bag slung over my shoulder, the cold air biting my cheeks. "You'll be okay?" he asked, not looking at me. "Yeah," I said, surprised by how true it felt. He nodded, then waved. A small, awkward gesture that made me smile. I walked to my car, the gravel crunching under my boots, and tossed my bag in the back seat. As I slid into the driver's seat, I set Ellen's notebook on the passenger side, its presence steadying. The engine hummed to life, and I pulled away, Carl's figure shrinking in the rearview mirror, his rocker still on the porch. The street stretched out, lined with bare trees and modest houses, each one holding its own stories. Driving past cornfields, the golden stalks swaying in the breeze, I felt the road open up, endless and full of possibility. The radio played a soft country tune, and I turned it up, the melody wrapping around me like a friend. I thought about the weekend, Brian's betrayal, Carl's quiet wisdom, the notebook now mine. I'd lost a marriage, a future I'd clung to, but I'd found something else. My own strength, a voice I hadn't known I had. The town faded behind me, its church steeple a final marker, and I let out a breath, long and slow. The hurt was still there, a bruise that would fade with time, but it didn't define me. I glanced at the notebook, its pages full of Ellen's hope, and knew I'd be okay. The road curved ahead, leading to a life I'd build on my terms, and for the first time in days I felt free.